Today I'm going to tell another exciting horror story, and I'll keep posting them. So subscribe and listen to scary stories every day. The Shadows of Redwood Forest. The road to Redwood. The car rumbled along the winding dirt road, a thin line of dust trailing in its wake as it carved deeper into the remote wilderness. Mia stared out of the window, watching the dense canopy of trees overhead grow thicker, their branches weaving together like tangled fingers, blocking out the light. The car was packed with camping gear, snacks, and 5 friends eager for a weekend of escape from the noise of the city. Redwood Forest, Ryan said, smirking at the group as he steered the car. Finally, we've been talking about this trip for years, and here we are. In the back seat, Zoe rolled her eyes, feigning a yawn. Yeah, and it's supposed to be what? Haunted? Ryan, you know I don't believe in that junk. Oh, come on, Zoe. Eva laughed, nudging her. Think about it. Spooky forest, complete darkness. Maybe we'll even hear an owl or two. It's like a live horror movie set. Lucas, their friend who had insisted on bringing his camera, grinned. I'm getting every minute of this on film, he announced, patting his camera like it was a treasure pet. We'll have the best video proof that there's nothing out here but trees and shadows. As they drove further into the forest, the trees became taller, their bark darker, the trunks closer together. The laughter and excitement started to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. The forest had a way of muffling sound, swallowing their voices as if the trees themselves were listening, judging. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Their final stop before the campsite was a small, dilapidated gas station. Ryan parked the car, and as the group piled out, the air seemed to thicken. An old man behind the counter gave them a look as they entered, his eyes narrowed and wary. Y'all going up to Redwood? He asked, his voice as dry as the dusty shells around him. Yep, Ryan said cheerfully, grabbing a pack of gum. Thought we'd rough it out in the woods. Make some memories. The old man didn't smile. His gaze swept over each of them, lingering on Mia. Well, don't go wandering too far. Stick to the marked trails. People go missing up there, and not all of them come back. Some things don't like being found. Mia shivered but tried to laugh it off, feeling the weight of his stare as they left. Classic horror movie warning, she whispered to Eva, trying to sound braver than she felt. But in her gut, the warning clung to her like a shadow. Setting up camp, the dirt road finally gave way to a narrow path barely visible between the towering trees. They parked the car, grabbed their gear, and hiked until they found a clearing nestled between a cluster of ancient redwoods. The clearing was eerily quiet, and the air felt damp, as if the trees themselves were breathing. Welcome to Camp Spooky, Ryan joked as he dumped his backpack onto the ground. It's just us and nature, or whatever else lives in these woods, Zoe muttered, looking around. Feels, I don't know, old. Ignoring her comment, they busied themselves with setting up tents, unfurling sleeping bags, and arranging their supplies. Lucas took his camera and wandered off a bit, capturing shots of the strange tree formations, of fungi clinging to bark and twisted roots clawing out of the ground like ancient skeletal fingers. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the clearing, they gathered around a small fire that Ryan had finally managed to light. The flames crackled, casting an orange glow that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. All right, ghost story time. Lucas grinned, zooming his camera in on each of their faces. They took turns sharing spooky tales, each story more ridiculous than the last. But every now and then, Mia thought she saw something, a quick flash of movement just beyond the firelight. She squinted, But each time, there was nothing, only shadows. When it was Mia's turn to tell a story, she hesitated, glancing nervously at the forest around them. So, I read somewhere that there was a guy who actually went missing up here. This wasn't like ages ago, it was recent. The rangers searched for him for weeks, but they only found his backpack. Nothing else. Ryan scoffed, tossing a stick into the fire. Probably just got lost. I mean, look at this place. You could go 10 feet from here and be totally invisible. Still, Mia said, lowering her voice, they say his spirit haunts the woods now, waiting for anyone who wanders too close. The group fell silent, each of them glancing nervously into the darkness. In that moment, they all felt it, a subtle, creeping fear that they weren't alone. The first sign, the morning arrived with a chill, a fog hanging over the forest like a blanket. The fire had died out, leaving only ashes and a faint smell of smoke. They woke up groggy, the night stories still lingering in their minds. As they were packing up for a short hike, Ryan wandered off for a bit, only to come back with something strange in his hands. "Look what I found," he said, holding up an old, rusted hunting knife. Its blade was chipped, but the edge still looked sharp, like it had been used recently. The handle was wrapped in frayed leather, dark with stains that could have been anything. Mia felt her stomach churn. "Where did you find that?" "Just over there, half buried in the dirt." He pointed to a spot near the edge of the clearing. "Kinda weird, huh? I mean, who just leaves a knife like this lying around?" Lucas laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Maybe it's our ghost's knife. He probably wants it back." They all laughed, but it was forced uneasy. Ryan tossed the knife into his bag, and they set off on the trail. The forest around them was thick, and the deeper they went, the darker it seemed to get. Sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopy above, casting dappled shadows that danced with every gust of wind. As they walked, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see something moving among the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of towering redwoods. The group stopped to take a break near a fallen tree, munching on trail mix and sipping from water bottles. That's when Mia saw it again, a quick flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, but again, there was nothing. "Did you guys see that?" she whispered. Eva looked at her, frowning. "See what?" Mia hesitated. I thought I saw someone." They all exchanged uneasy glances. Ryan rolled his eyes. "Relax, Mia. It's just the woods playing tricks on you." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She glanced back at the knife in Ryan's bag, the leather-wrapped handle barely visible. There was something ominous about it, like it was a warning they hadn't heeded. They continued on, but as they moved deeper into the woods, a sense of dread settled over them. The silence grew heavier, the usual forest sounds replaced by an eerie quiet. Each footstep seemed too loud, echoing through the trees. Then, as they rounded a bend, they found it, a lone, broken-down campsite hidden among the trees. The tent was torn, flapping in the breeze, and the scattered remnants of supplies lay strewn around. A sleeping bag lay partially unzipped, as if someone had left in a hurry. Lucas lifted his camera, documenting the scene. "Maybe it's from someone who got lost," he suggested, though his voice trembled slightly. Mia approached the site cautiously, her eyes scanning the ground. Her heart skipped a beat when she spotted it, a small, red scarf, tangled in the branches of a nearby bush. She recognized it. Zoe's scarf. "Well, what's going on?" she whispered, holding the scarf up for the others to see. The realization hit them like a punch. Zoe had been with them just minutes ago, walking behind Eva. They had all heard her, seen her, yet now she was nowhere to be found. Fear settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Zoe was gone, and they were stranded in a forest that suddenly felt a lot darker, a lot more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. And somewhere hidden in the trees, something or someone was watching them. The missing friend. Panic set in almost instantly as the group realized Zoe had disappeared. Just moments ago, she'd been chatting behind them, walking slowly as she admired the scenery. Now, all that was left was her red scarf, snagged on a bush. Zoe! Mia's voice cracked as she called out, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. Ryan, Lucas, and Eva joined in, each calling Zoe's name, their shouts blending into a desperate, anxious chorus. But no response came. This isn't funny anymore, Eva muttered, hugging herself. Her face was pale, and Mia could see fear flickering in her eyes. She was right behind us, Ryan said, pacing in circles. How could she just vanish? She wouldn't go off on her own like that. Lucas raised his camera, looking through the lens as if hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the viewfinder. Maybe she's playing a prank? She always loved scaring us. But Mia felt a cold certainty in her gut that this was no prank. Zoe wasn't the type to wander off without a word, especially not after the strange things they'd seen. Something about the silence of the forest felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. We need to find her, Mia said firmly. Maybe she got lost, maybe she's hurt. Let's split up and search. Reluctantly, they agreed, spreading out within earshot of each other. Mia moved cautiously through the underbrush, scanning every shadow, every strange shape. But the forest grew darker as clouds rolled over, and an eerie mist began to drift through the trees. Every snap of a twig made her jump, and the feeling that something was watching her was almost unbearable. After what felt like hours, they regrouped, each looking increasingly frantic. No one had seen or heard any sign of Zoe. This is bad, Ryan said, his voice thick with fear. Really bad. We're completely cut off out here. No cell signal, no help. What if she's in real trouble? Or worse, Eva whispered, clutching her arms around herself. Their nerves frayed, they decided to head back to camp, hoping Zoe had somehow made her way there. But when they arrived, there was nothing but the cold, dying remnants of their campfire and the shadows of the trees stretching ominously over their tents. The hunt begins. Dread settled over the group as night fell, the darkness swallowing the forest. The fire crackled weakly as they sat huddled around it, each of them casting nervous glances into the blackness just beyond the firelight. Mia stared into the shadows, feeling her pulse race every time the fire sputtered. She thought she saw movement, small, subtle, as if someone or something was watching from just out of sight. I keep feeling like someone's here with us, she whispered. Lucas tightened his grip on his camera. Maybe it's Zoe. Maybe she's hiding. But as the hours wore on and Zoe still didn't return, hope began to fade. A thick silence settled over the campsite, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves, each sound making them jump. Finally, Ryan stood up, his face pale and drawn. We can't just sit here. If we stay put, we're next. Eva's voice shook. Next for what? Ryan looked away, his expression grim. For whatever took Zoe. They decided to take shifts watching the fire, each of them sitting alone while the others tried to rest. Mia's shift came first, and she sat by the fire, her senses alert, the weight of her own heartbeat heavy in her chest. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows creeping closer with each passing minute. Then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like someone whispering her name. Her heart pounding, Mia looked around, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Zoe," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was no answer, only the silence of the woods, pressing in tighter, suffocating. Survival instincts. By morning, the group was on edge, exhausted and paranoid. The events of the night had frayed their nerves, and Mia noticed that each of them looked more haunted, their faces drawn and pale. They packed their things, abandoning the campsite, and decided to head back to the car. But as they retraced their steps, the trail seemed different. Landmarks they'd passed on the way and were gone. The trees somehow denser, the air thicker, like the forest itself was changing to keep them there. "We didn't come this way, did we?" Eva asked, her voice thin and frightened. "It doesn't matter. We just need to keep moving," Ryan said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Hours passed, and still they couldn't find their way back. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees when they stumbled upon something they didn't expect, a different campsite, abandoned and disheveled, hidden deep in the woods. The tents were torn, and scattered belongings lay strewn around. A half-buried backpack, a weathered jacket, and a pair of shoes covered in dried mud. But as they looked closer, Mia's heart sank. Among the debris, she recognized something chilling. Zoe's backpack, half buried beneath a pile of leaves. "Oh my God," she whispered, backing away. Lucas knelt down, pulling the backpack out from the dirt. This was hers. She was here. The group exchanged terrified glances, each of them realizing the grim possibility. Zoe hadn't just wandered off. Something or someone had taken her, and whatever it was, it had left this macabre scene as a warning. "Let's get out of here," Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. But as they turned to leave, a rustling sound came from the trees. They froze, listening, their hearts pounding as the sound grew louder. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, as if someone or something was circling them. They bolted, running through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ominous sounds behind them. The killer revealed, breathless and disoriented. They finally stopped, each of them gasping for air. But the footsteps had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence of the forest. Mia looked around, trying to calm her racing heart. That was close," Lucas gasped, clutching his camera to his chest. Ryan looked back the way they'd come, his face tense. "We need to keep moving. Whatever that was, it's still out there." But as they turned, they saw him. A man, gaunt tall, his face obscured by a tattered hood, standing silently among the trees, watching them with an unervingly calm gaze. For a moment, they froze, staring at the figure in shock. His clothes were ragged, caked in dirt and grime, as though he'd been living in the forest for years. In one hand, he held a large, rusty knife, the same knife Ryan had found near their camp. "Run!" Mia screamed, breaking the silence, her voice piercing through the air. They scattered, each of them darting in different directions, their footsteps frantic and panicked. The killer moved silently, his footsteps soft and calculated, his eyes never leaving his prey. He moved like he was part of the forest, blending in with the shadows, his steps in perfect rhythm with the sounds of the woods. Lucas, clutching his camera, stumbled and fell, his foot caught on a hidden root. He looked up, terror flooding his eyes as the killer approached, the knife gleaming in his hand. But as the man raised his arm, Mia grabbed a branch, swinging it with all her strength and hitting him in the shoulder. "Run, Lucas!" she shouted, pulling him to his feet. They sprinted through the trees, the killer's footsteps growing softer as they finally broke free, reaching a small clearing. Panting, they looked back, but the man had vanished, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. Their brief escape brought little relief. As the group caught their breath, each of them knew one terrible truth. They were not alone. The killer was still out there, hunting them with an eerie patience, stalking them through the maze of trees. The forest had become a twisted nightmare, each shadow a threat, every sound a warning. With their fear escalating and the killer closing in, they realized there was only one way out, to find him first. But as night fell and darkness consumed the forest, Mia wondered if they would survive long enough to see the light of morning. Into the darkness. With nightfall closing in, Mia, Ryan, Lucas, and Eva huddled together, their faces drawn with terror and exhaustion. The realization had sunk in. They weren't just lost. They were being hunted. The killer moved like a shadow, slipping through the trees, using the dense forest as his cover. "We need a plan," Ryan whispered, his eyes darting around the clearing. "If we keep running, he'll pick us off one by one." "Do you think it's him?" Lucas asked, gripping his camera. "The guy from the stories. The one who vanished? They said he was insane, that he never wanted to be found." The theory was chilling, but it made sense. A deranged hermit hiding in the vastness of Redwood Forest, preying on those who dared to enter his domain. Mia's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "We can't just sit here waiting for him to strike. We need to set a trap." They quickly gathered what little they had, ropes, branches, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. They chose a spot between two massive redwoods, the underbrush thick enough to mask their preparations. It was a risk, but it was all they had. As they worked, they kept glancing over their shoulders, straining their ears for any sound that might signal his approach. Each creak of a branch, each rustle of leaves, sent their hearts racing. When the trap was set, they lay in wait, each hidden behind thick tree trunks, clutching their makeshift weapons, their breaths held. Hours passed, the tension mounting, until finally they heard it. The soft crunch of leaves, the careful, deliberate steps of someone moving closer. The killer's figure emerged from the shadows, his silhouette a haunting outline against the darkness. He was silent, almost ghostly, as he approached the trap. Ryan made the first move, springing from his hiding place and swinging a heavy branch at the killer's legs. But the man was faster than they'd anticipated. He dodged, his expression calm, his eyes almost amused. "Run!" Mia shouted, but the killer moved with terrifying speed, lunging toward her with a knife raised. She ducked, narrowly avoiding the blade, and stumbled back, her heart pounding as the killer's gaze locked on her, his expression a chilling mix of rage and determination. The chase. The group scattered, each of them darting into the maze of trees, their breaths shallow and panicked. Mia could hear the killer's footsteps close behind, his pace unrelenting. Her pulse thundered as she sprinted through the darkness, the forest a blur around her. Eva's voice echoed through the trees, sharp and panicked. "He's coming after me!" Mia changed direction, following Eva's voice, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything, to slow him down. Her gaze fell on a broken branch, its jagged end pointing up from the ground like a makeshift spike. She grabbed it, positioning herself behind a tree, waiting. As the killer closed in on Eva, Mia lunged from the shadows, thrusting the branch toward him. It grazed his shoulder, tearing through his sleeve. He stumbled, momentarily thrown off balance, and Mia seized the chance, grabbing Eva and pulling her away. The two of them ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they stumbled through the dense forest, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the killer as possible. But the man's steps echoed behind them, relentless, closer with every second. Suddenly, they broke through the trees and into a narrow ravine. The only way forward was across a fallen tree that bridged the gap. Mia hesitated, glancing back at the shadowy figure approaching. "Go," she urged Eva, her voice urgent. Eva scrambled across the fallen tree, her steps unsteady. Mia followed, glancing over her shoulder as the killer reached the edge of the ravine, his gaze fixed on them. For a moment, she thought he might turn back. But then he stepped onto the tree, his movements calm, controlled, as if he knew they had nowhere left to run. Confrontation. On the other side of the ravine, Ryan and Lucas emerged from the shadows, their faces etched with determination. They had gathered rocks, branches, anything they could throw, and they hurled them at the killer as he crossed the fallen tree. One of the rocks struck him in the chest, and he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. But he caught himself, his expression never wavering, his eyes cold and calculating. Slowly, deliberately, he continued forward, undeterred. "Lucas, now!" Ryan shouted, and Lucas, gripping his camera, sprinted forward, wielding it like a weapon. The killer barely reacted as Lucas swung the camera, catching him across the jaw. But as Lucas backed away, the man raised his knife, slashing through the air with precision. The blade caught Lucas's arm, and he cried out in pain, stumbling back, clutching his bleeding arm. Mia's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give them an advantage. Her gaze fell on a fallen branch, heavy and thick. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and swung with all her strength, striking the killer in the side. The man staggered, and for a brief moment his expression shifted, anger, frustration, pain. But then his gaze fixed on Mia, a glint of something darker flickering in his eyes. In that moment, Mia realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't hunting them because he was lost or insane. He was hunting them because he enjoyed it. Escape or die. The killer lunged at Mia, his knife slicing through the air. She dodged, barely avoiding the blade, and stumbled back, her mind racing. They couldn't keep fighting him. He was too strong, too relentless. Their only hope was to escape. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Eva's arm and pulling her toward a narrow path through the trees. Ryan and Lucas followed, their breaths labored, their steps unsteady. They tore through the underbrush, their hearts pounding as they plunged deeper into the forest. The killer's footsteps echoed behind them, relentless, growing closer with every second. Suddenly, Mia saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. The road, the car, salvation. They sprinted toward it, their muscles burning, their lungs aching as they pushed forward, desperate to reach the safety of the car. But as they broke through the trees and stumbled onto the road, they realized their nightmare was far from over. The killer was right behind them, his footsteps steady, his gaze locked on them, as if he knew they had nowhere left to hide. Ryan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the car. Come on," The doors finally unlocked, and they piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the killer reached the edge of the road. He stood there, watching them, his expression calm, almost disappointed, as if he had expected more from his prey. As Ryan started the engine, the killer took a step forward, his eyes locked on Mia through the window. She met his gaze, a chill running down her spine as she saw the promise in his eyes. A promise that he wasn't finished with them yet. The car lurched forward, the wheels spinning on the gravel as they sped down the road, leaving the killer behind. But Mia knew, as they disappeared into the night, that the memory of his gaze would haunt her forever. Shadows that linger. The drive back to civilization was a blur. Each of them too shaken to speak, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. When they finally reached the nearest town, they stumbled out of the car, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. They went straight to the police, their voices shaky as they recounted the nightmare they'd endured. The officers listened, their expressions skeptical at first, but as the details unfolded, the abandoned campsite, Zoe's disappearance, the killer's relentless pursuit, their skepticism faded, replaced by grim understanding. The forest was searched thoroughly, but no trace of the killer was found. No footprints, no campsite, no knife. It was as if he had vanished into the shadows, slipping back into the depths of Redwood Forest, leaving only fear in his wake. Days passed, and the group tried to return to their normal lives, but the memory of the killer's gaze lingered, haunting them like a shadow that wouldn't fade. Each of them knew, deep down, that they had escaped Redwood Forest by chance, a stroke of luck that might not hold if they ever dared to return. For Mia, the nightmares came often, vivid and relentless. In her dreams, she was back in the forest, the shadows closing in, the killer's footsteps echoing through the trees. And every time, just before she awoke, she would see him, standing among the trees, watching, waiting, his gaze promising that he would find her again. Because Redwood Forest had a secret, a darkness that lingered, a hunter who thrived on fear. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, he was still there, waiting for the next group of campers who would wander too far into his domain, unaware of the horror that awaited them. The end.